I think we can go ahead and start. I see Chad Hoffman has joined us. So welcome, Chad. David, if you can share the screen, you probably already have, but I know Chad wants to be able to share his screen. I've known Chad for many years because he was a mentor. He followed a student from middle school up through high school graduation, and student graduated, I think, back in 2010. I know he worked at Human Kinetics at one time, and then he was a co-owner of Rogards, I believe, for several years. And Chad, you'll have to tell how long you've been the director of Habitat for Humanity. I'm guessing 4 or 5 years maybe, but I'm not sure about that. So welcome, Chad.
Thanks, Lauren, for the welcome. And yeah, we have been known each other for some time. I think it was I got done mentoring 10 years ago now, which is just crazy. I'm interested in getting back to helping students again. I've coached my son's soccer team, and I have 2 teens of my own. So I do love working with youth, and hopefully we'll have some time to do that here coming up. Lauren kind of mentioned that I'm was a mentor. I've also served on the board of the reading group. So and I saw Marilyn Kay was on here somewhere. So hello, Marilyn. I think she's off camera right now, but I saw her name pop up. So, but excited to present today about Habitat. I have been with Habitat for 3 years now. I was in for-profit before jumping over to nonprofit about 7 years ago, but I've always been active in the community, volunteering and participating, and love Habitat. So, but today I'm not here to really talk about Habitat. I'm here to talk about housing inequities as it relates to race, and specifically some data in regards to Champaign County. This presentation, and I will share my screen in a minute, this presentation came about in regards to some funding that United Way had that was called Healing Illinois funding, and it was to help bridge some of the race divide that exists in our community and other communities. And the grant money really allowed me the time to step aside and do some research. The funds still went to Habitat, but it made me feel that I could kind of take some time and really put some data together as it relates to housing here in our community. This presentation wasn't my idea per se. I saw a similar presentation in Chicago in regards to some disparities that existed there. And I kind of was watching that and know what Habitat does. And I said, well, Champaign County's got to be better and have a better history, and with the university ties and some of the other things. But kind of as I put the data together, I was surprised myself of where some of it ended up. So with that said, I'm going to share my screen and kind of talk through this presentation. So just a brief history of Habitat and how racial justice impacts where we're at today. Originally, Habitat International, there was a farm established in Georgia where all people were treated equally regardless of race. With the establishment of that farm, unfortunately, times were even more restrictive, obviously, than they were today. All the members, both Black and white, were excommunicated from their churches for their views on racial equity, that everybody could live together in harmony. They did find following those still in the community for their products. They were doing canning and selling crops and so forth. But by 1956, there was a boycott locally of all their products, and they were not able to make money or help produce for their overall farm operation and help the residents who all lived together. Luckily, others heard of their strife and their situation and began buying products outside of the local community. And by 1957, their founder of that farm, Clarence Jordan, received support from Martin Luther King Jr. And that kind of helped, spur sales and get others interested in what they were doing there. So that farm was then visited by Millard and Linda Fuller. They were truly the founders of Habitat for Humanity. They loved the idea of housing being built for members who lived there. They loved the idea of living together and racial equity. And that kind of got them going, okay, this is great for this little area in Georgia. How do we expand that further? So they started to move partner housing, volunteer housing being built for others in the community. In 1968, they had the idea, and by 1969, the first Habitat house was built in Georgia. How that compares to Habitat here in Champaign County, racial equity was a big push. Some of the racial injustice clear back in 1991. A group of community members came together and were trying to figure out ways to help reduce some of the inequities that existed in our community. And Habitat for Humanity was not the only thing that came out of those meetings and discussions, but it was one of the results of those meetings. Was a Habitat chapter was found in Champaign County. So just like international, the first house was built 1 year later. Same thing locally. By 1992, we had built our first house. We are now up to 121 houses built. We just dedicated 118. I'm counting a solar house we did and 2 others that will be finished this spring, and then 121 that are completed. And in terms of our service area, service population, over 90% of our homeowners are minority. That's not intentional. We obviously accept applications from anyone wanting to own a home. That's just generally the percentage of applicants we get as well are typically minority. So we are doing a huge service. It's well over $10 million that of value we've added back to the community with those houses, between property taxes and home ownership growth and wealth and a number of other things since our founding. So that's kind of the basics, but I kind of want to get into a little bit about redlining. I can explain it, but I think there's this video I'm going to show here for a second. It's from Adam Ruins Everything. It talks about redlining. He's a little more entertaining than me and has quite a bit of facts he puts in here too. So I'm going to share this video. It's about 5 minutes, and then we'll continue on. All right, I'll put my presentation back up there. I just want everybody to see that. I thought he explained redlining very well. So then I took that and really wanted to look at how that impacted kind of where we were at Champaign County, in addition to some of the other data I had seen. So let me get back here now and share my screen again. Oops. Okay. So segregation in Champaign County, we think maybe Chicago or St. Louis or Indianapolis or bigger cities around us, but racially restricted covenants were the primary mechanism used to segregate African Americans between 41 and 1950 in Champaign County. There were racially restrictive covenants, as mentioned in the video here. I read this whenever I give the presentation because I think there's a lot of power in it.
Oh, yeah.
And it says, no part thereof will be sold or leased either in whole or in part to or permitted to be occupied as owner or tenant by any person or persons not of the Caucasian race. So that's what was on the books here in Champaign County. In 1951, public housing units were built, 70 for white, 70 for black families. Sounds very equal theoretically, but the total cost was $1.47 million. But only 21% of that spending went towards the Birch Court subdivision, and the rest went to administrative costs in the white housing unit. So the spending was clearly not even, significantly different. And even still in 1965, the University of Illinois, 52% of houses were uncertified and were not listed because of the operator's failure to sign a pledge of non-discrimination. So this was happening in Champaign County. We're definitely not immune from a historical perspective. So, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. It's one of my favorite Mark Twain quotes. And I think that's where the presentation kind of leads us from an Illinois perspective, but also from a Champaign County perspective. Segregation, they talked about that in the redlining presentation. It's not about old Jim Crow laws. It is about the division of where people live. And through a governing magazine study, Champaign, Urbana, and Springfield are more segregated than the Mobile, Alabama area, which is very famous from historical perspective. That's the Daphne area. So we are more segregated than many southern cities. Peoria, if it plays in Peoria, is kind of the saying around here. It's actually this country's sixth most racially divided metro area in terms of blacks and whites, especially when it comes to schools. It's the most segregated in the nation. So this is an area for central Illinois as a whole, in cities of our size. So where does that fit in terms of the overall Illinois population in terms of mortgages? This is really talking about racial equity and home ownership. That's the focus of it. So when you look at the total population, Black households are 15% of the population, but they only receive 7% of new mortgages, whereas whites are 62% of the population, but they receive 75% of new mortgages. So pretty telling in regards to, hold 75% of mortgages. They're 62% of the population, but hold 75% of mortgages. The Black denial rate across the whole state of Illinois is 30%, whereas the white denial rate for mortgage applications is 16%. So pretty powerful numbers, but this is kind of what got me to dig into the Champaign numbers a little bit more and get more specific. Home ownership in Champaign County, total households in Champaign, 72% are white. They make up 84% of home ownership, whereas home ownership in Champaign County, Black households make up 12% of the population, but only 6% of home ownership. So that stability, some of that wealth that can be earned from a home is definitely not present. It's definitely lacking currently and historically. And in comparison, just so we have a comparison, because it comes up a little bit later, Asians make up 9% of the population and 5% of homes owned, since we do have a significantly large Asian population in Champaign County. Here's the overall home ownership rate. White population as a whole, 62% are home ownership. Homeowners, 28%. For Black households, 26% for Asian households. So when you look at the overall home ownership rate in Champaign County, it is low. Here's one of the more troubling statistics as a whole in my perception, especially when you look at the percentage. So overall, Black households are applying at a much lower rate for loans. There is definitely an interest, but I think there is a challenge. We know from Habitat that we get over 100 applicants for 4 homes that we usually are able to build a year. So there's a huge need, but it's not apparent that banks are the outlet to provide loans for those who are trying to get into home ownership, especially low income at times. So there is a under application percentage for sure from Black households. And then the approval rating is definitely close to that overall Illinois number we looked at earlier, that 30% rejection rate. When you look at white and Asian households, those not approved, which not approved is withdrawn, incomplete data, or rejection rate. And I can tell you the rejection rate is higher for Blacks than it is for Asians or whites, but overall not approved percentage is over 33%. So even when loans are being applied for, they're being denied at a higher rate. So keep in mind that Black households are applying at a lower rate to begin with, which we saw from the previous slide, and then they're not getting approved at the same rate as other minorities even, and also white households for sure. Once approved, it was talked about a little bit in the redlining video at the start too, that not approved for as high a value once loans are approved. So Black households are approved at $158,000, $159 if you round up, whereas white and Asian households are approved for much larger loans. The difference is a 13% lower value when Black households are approved for loans as a whole. That's just part of the story. I mean, for overall, for low income, anybody trying to get into a purchase scenario, home prices are escalating at a alarming rate, especially entry level houses. There is high demand and limited supply. The overall rate is around 11%. Lower cost homes, though, are growing at 13%. Even with increases in wages of 5 to 7%, you are not able to afford a home because home prices are even outpacing that growth in wages. Home prices relative to incomes is still a huge concern. Over 17.6 million households are spending more than 50% of their income on housing. Once you get over 30, it's really hard to continue to pay for school supplies, to continue to have any type of health care, to pay for food, all the other expenses that go with life. Once you get over 50%, it's unsustainable. So to have this percentage and the limited supply of housing, it does make it unstable for many at those lowest income earners. In terms of the escalating home prices, again, median sale price of single family homes continue to rise faster than incomes. 9th straight year that's happened. So we're continuing to see incomes raise, which is good for lower income, but they're not raising as quickly as housing, even renting is. So renting or home ownership, it's problematic for that gap that exists. And only 24% of new homes constructed are less than 1,800 square feet. 10 years ago, that was 32%. So you're really looking at a huge shortage of entry-level homes, not only in our community, but in communities across the country. So those who are interested in home ownership, who save for home ownership, have to save significantly more because prices are increasing. But it's also more difficult to save because they're paying more for rent as a percentage of their overall earnings. So it's kind of a double whammy in terms of where we're at. And then there's not homes on top of that, right? Supply and demand. There's just not many homes out there in good neighborhoods at lower prices. This is specific to Champaign County. In the last 3 years, it's not 13%, it's 18%. So, you've got a pretty big increase. I guarantee that entry-level wages have increased. I'm not downplaying that. They have went up some, and that's some COVID driven, obviously, but 18% is a lot to make up for someone at an entry-level wage. So I would be remiss if I didn't at least talk about COVID just a minute in terms of delinquencies, what that means. Delinquencies for white homeowners is a little over 5%. It's right about 7%. Black homeowners, it's about 17%. Hispanics and Asians, it's right around 16%. So those discrepancies that already exist in regards to home ownership, without additional funding to help support some home ownership mortgage payments along the way, which some are coming in the spring, that discrepancy of home ownership percentage is only going to grow as a whole, nationwide and in Champaign County. Why is this? What is part of the reasoning behind some of this? Income and wealth inequality. This is the one that I found to be maybe as troubling as some of the rejection rates at the banks is in the last 10 years, the gap between low and high income households grew. I think we've probably heard that a little bit in some of the stories, is that we have this disappearing kind of middle class. So the higher income earners in our community are doing very well, but the lower income earners are not doing as well. And the middle class is kind of disappearing as jobs move overseas and elsewhere. But what does that mean in terms of race? Median incomes for Black households did grow, but Black household incomes rose much more slowly. And in absolute terms than white household incomes, which means the income gap is actually wider than it has been in decades. So here's the actual numbers. The median income for Black households, this is back to 2019. I don't have the 20 data yet, was 43,200. The median income for white households was 70,900. Even more telling is the wealth gap. And this goes back to some of that history of not having parents that were homeowners, potentially not having, that wealth that's passed down from generations because of home ownership. In 2019, the median white household held $188,200 in wealth, whereas the typical Black household only held $24,100. So that is very telling in terms of the diversity that exists in terms of the wealth that exists between the two different groups. So it's not all bad news, in my opinion. I mean, Habitat has built, like I said, over 118 houses. 121 will be fully completed by spring. We do have huge impact when we are able to build homes. That wealth impact is diminished or replaced because that is something that can be passed on to children. We do know that children of homeowners are less likely to be arrested. They're less likely to become teen parents. They're also less likely to have substance abuse issues. Children of homeowners are 25% more likely to graduate from high school. And then also the statistic is not made up, 116% more likely to graduate from college. So we know there's stability that comes with home ownership. It's not only some of these statistics, but health outcomes are improved with home ownership. Obviously, ability to continue to move forward in life, it's less likely to rely on social service requirements as home ownership. So homeowners, the estimate is $34,000 per household that is saved in the community when you're a homeowner versus a renter. So there is a lot of benefits. We do really push at Habitat home ownership being one element that can help solve some of the ills that exist out there. And I do believe that it takes time for some of that to occur. So with that, I think I've probably taken about a half an hour. I'm pretty close. I will open it up for questions for anybody who has something to ask.
I'll take one. I had discussed this with a friend, and she said, I was asking her about redlining, and I asked also someone who's on a bank board about this, and he said, well, the banks really don't have any choice. So I have two questions. One is, the banks are constrained by the federal rules. And beyond that, do you see that the differences are because they're still exercising some discretion beyond those rules? And the second question I have is, so their friend said, oh, well, the credit reporting was supposed to solve that. It was supposed to be just about numbers, and that would eliminate this discrimination, or go a long way in eliminating it, because it was all numbers. And clearly that didn't happen. So those are my two questions.
So I would say there's a couple things at play there that I think is I don't think it's intentional discrimination in most cases anymore, even in our local community. I think it's ingrained in some of the policies and requirements that exist. So I also do think that there is some distrust of banks that exist. And that's why I think once you look at the withdrawal rate, especially for potential Black homeowners, they withdraw at 2 to 3 times the rate of white homeowners. So I think like a bank might shoot back a question and say, hey, I need some more information, or I don't understand this. And instead of potentially being viewed in some cases as a question, it's viewed as, oh, I'm just going to get rejected anyways. I'm not even going to move forward. So I do think there is still some potential pushback, but also possibly some banks who are maybe not as upfront and asking some questions that would cause someone to withdraw, that they should move through the process. So I do think there's a little bit of both in that withdrawal rate. So I think that's part of the problem. Some of the income and wealth discrepancies that exist historically have caused this to continue to be fed forward in terms of bank rejection rates. So I think that's some of the numbers you're talking about where it's part of the system. Secondly, I think in terms of the studies that show that banks are still, when they do finally settle on a rate, because of some undervalued properties in historically Black neighborhoods, we know appraisals are lower, that discrimination still exists, that it is difficult to get approved for or sell houses at the rates that they should be in those neighborhoods. I think that's part of it as well, and some of what you see in those approval rates for mortgages. So I do think there is still some systematic racism that exists in the system, is what I would say.
Well,
does that help answer that question?
It does, but I have a follow-up. The person I talked to who is on the bank board I think he would say, well, the bank doesn't have any choice. Once the property's been undervalued, the bank is constrained by that.
Right. And I'm not blaming the banks in that regard. I mean, I think that is more, when we get to appraisals and other things, that's where it becomes systematic, right? It's not just banks or just not individuals. It's these things need to be looked at as a whole and in totality.
Okay, Jancy has her hand up.
Hi, Chad. Thank you so much for the presentation. I just had a question about, Champaign-Urbana is a university town. We've had a tremendous amount of housing growth and rental, housing, mostly for students. I'm just curious, what impact does that have on our housing situation in our community in terms of how, the university drives up rents and things like that and impacts access to housing?
Yeah, you kind of said it in there. And I think that it's University Town, we are actually very welcoming in regards to several race studies that have been completed. And I think it's wonderful in terms of what we're able to do. But rent is one of those that is driven up by the student housing that exists. So even though there's a number of student housing units continuing to be added, the prices keep growing, and they're definitely growing faster than median incomes are growing in town. So almost all of Habitat homeowners we find to live in a decent, affordable rental home even or apartment is cost prohibitive for entry-level jobs. And when I say entry-level jobs, I just want to be clear. Our homeowners work at Carl, OSF, University of Illinois. We're not, not saying they don't have other jobs as well that you might think in service industries typically, but these are full-time positions of people and individuals who are not able to get a traditional mortgage in a full-time, what would be deemed, I guess, a good job in town. So rents, and of those, 75 to 90% of them are rent burdened in terms of that traditional definition of 30% or more of their income are going towards rent. We just had a family accepted into our program, had a 2-bedroom apartment, 4 kids and a mother and a father living in a 2-bedroom apartment. And as you can imagine, I can't imagine how that would have worked successfully during COVID when all 4 of the kids were school age and trying to Zoom in when you're remote learning. So, but based on what they could afford, that was the apartment that they were able to manage. So it's a challenge in our community because rents are high in comparison to other communities.
Chad, could I ask a question? I don't know am I on?
Yes, you are on.
In this community, I have seen rental properties, apartments that were built a quarter of a century ago or less, not in dereliction, but certainly not kept up. How much housing how much is the housing situation affected by rental properties that aren't kept up and that go into something, I mean, that clearly are deteriorating. I mean, is there enforcement of property maintenance? I see Daryl next to you is saying yes. The two of you can answer that. I just.
Okay, City of Urbana does routine inspections. They're supposed to be on a 3-year rotation. Champaign only does complaint inspections, and they do the hallways and communal areas of multifamilies. And I do Section 8 inspections. So there's numerous inspections going on. Rantoul does I'm not sure what their rotation is, but Rantoul does inspections on a routine basis of all rental units. So overall, I'd say our stock is probably in better shape than say Chicago, which it does have enforcement as well, but they're so spread out. Over the 7 years I've done Section 8 inspections, I've gotten into a lot better units, and people are finding units. I'm not seeing the bad units, especially in Champaign, that I used to see. Now, that's not saying they're still not being rented out. They're not being rented out to Section 8. Those landlords that are trying to stay away from the city in Champaign are able to do so because a lot of people are afraid to complain. But
And I would agree. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I think I agree that there's still quality issues for some, but I think quantity of units at a reasonable price is the bigger issue. So I would kind of echo what Daryl's saying in that regard. And there's always issues, sure. I mean, there's still bad landlords. I don't mean it like that, but I think it's a quantity and price issue right now.
I'm curious if a minority person comes to the community who say come to the university, they have a really good salary, they can afford to buy what they want. Are they impacted by any of the issues you're talking about, or can they pretty much live where they want to live?
Well, I mean, I think if it's, a good paying wage, yeah, I think there's still options in Champaign, and there is housing developments going on in Champaign. But they're almost all over that 1,800, 2,000 square foot house that's not affordable to an entry level position. So, yeah, I mean, I think we're talking, earnings $40,000 per year or below generally as a family, give or take. Does that help what you were kind of asking?
So in Urbana, in terms of rentals, you can't discriminate based on income. But Champaign, you can. So for Section 8, they'll in Urbana, you can't discriminate based on that. Although I did see one sign where the landlord said no Section 8, I turned them into the city and they got them. So that sign disappeared. So, but yeah, Champaign still allows that. And landlords can find ways to discriminate without blatantly discriminating. There's numerous landlords that keep their their rents just above what Section 8 allows, and so it's or they say that the tenant has to have 3 times, basically 33% of their income would only go towards rent, which is what you want, but that does lock out a lot of people who are forced to use a higher percentage of that just to live on. Well, I do have one comment on your presentation. Hopefully it's constructive criticism. You use the term good neighborhoods. I try not to use that term when I'm talking to people. I try to use, I guess, wealthier incomes, lower income neighborhoods, because I found that there's some really good, what I consider to be really good neighborhoods that are surrounded by neighborhoods that people wouldn't necessarily feel that are as good. I usually ask the tenant, is the neighborhood quiet? And if it's quiet, they usually like it and they usually stay there much longer. So that to me would be a good neighborhood.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to define good neighborhood, bad neighborhood.
I know. Yeah. It's just sometimes that can be taken the wrong way.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll watch that. I appreciate that.
Jancy? You're muted.
Sorry, I had a very loud baby with me. I just had a follow-up question kind of tying onto David's point. I think so often we think of, racial segregation, whether it's in housing or whether it's in schools, it's a other out there like Chicago, St. Louis area. And I think your presentation demonstrated very clearly today that this is a very real and ongoing issue in our county, despite what sounds like there's some really positive anecdotal data that people who don't identify as white are feeling very welcome in our town, which I think is good. But, are there resources that we can, publicly available resources and data that sort of demonstrate this other side of it, that there is still very much some issues with school segregation and housing segregation in our town, that it's not just this thing that happens in the South or in Chicago or St. Louis, et cetera?
I'm not quite sure I understood the full question, but I do think that all the studies I've seen, I don't have them all in front of me today, really do talk about, if you dig into that Governing Magazine article that I cited at the beginning, it really does talk about us being welcoming and discrimination in terms of rentals, because we do have such a transient population, being less than in surrounding communities. So we do see that people are rented to, regardless of race, generally speaking. I'm not saying discrimination doesn't happen, but we do have a better track record on that front. So there are some positives in terms of where we're at as a community, and we are definitely more welcoming than other communities, even in Central Illinois, based on some of those data points. But it still doesn't mean that racial disparity doesn't exist from a wealth and home ownership perspective.
I think that's what I meant in terms of, is that data about the wealth distribution and the access to home loans as disaggregated by race that you shared?
The county produces a state of the county document. I'm not sure how often it comes out, but it's really good at, now that's the entire county. So it shows things. I think last time I looked at 240,000 people in the county, 20% poverty rate, So that's what, 44,000 people are living under poverty in Champaign County. So you can get some numbers from that that are pretty good.
What was that
Yeah.
number? How many are living in poverty?
So we've got basically about a 20% poverty rate in Champaign County. Last time I looked at it, I can't remember how long ago that was, so the numbers may have changed a little bit. But last time I looked, 20% poverty rate, approximately 240,000 people at the time in Champaign County. That's 45,000 people living under poverty was considered by the government in poverty. And just remember, you have a family of 7, you can be making quite a bit of money and still be considered living in poverty.
Yeah.
Did you have a question?
I do. Well, first I have a comment. My kids went to Urbana High School and they're in their 30s now, said that they were surprised that what was relatively diverse education was unusual when they got away to college and they realized how many of their friends had not gone to school in a very diverse situation. Then my actual question is, so if low-income people are withdrawing their loan applications or not feeling good about going to banks in the first place, what other resources are there for help? I mean, I know about Cunningham Township. Are there other places that people can get help with housing if they can't get a loan?
Yeah, I mean, there is rental assistance now, and we're even counseling through some rental assistance. I know there's several programs going on in town in regards to rental assistance. So there are places for help to get aid, especially with some of the new funding that's been available recently. In terms of overall, I think to me the question more is like if someone is feeling discriminated against they can call Habitat. We are a HUD certified counseling agency. We can help file a complaint if that's necessary. Land and Lincoln Legal Aid can help work through that. I mean, obviously we want to make sure that there are issues where realtors aren't showing, one family at this house, but not another family. So, those are the things we talk through. I've talked to a number of realty associations with this presentation and help them realize some of the discrimination that's underlying in our system at the very least. So I think that's where it really needs to make this change is in those areas. So, but
Thanks.
I have a question about Habitat, if that's okay. I'm
Sure.
curious about, do you guys track how many of your homeowners are able to move up in terms of buying a larger home or a bigger home versus those who end up not being able to maintain their homes in terms of, you guys track that, and do you have numbers about that? I'm just curious.
So, yeah. So, I mean, I'm going to answer this just a little different in terms of more, overall our loan, we do own our loans. When we do a home for a homeowner, it's a hand up, not a handout. So it is a mortgage. It's a 0 interest mortgage. And we do also help with some down payment assistance, which homeowners need, partly that gap. They're not able to put enough money aside as they're just paying rent to get by. So we're helping on those fronts when they first get into the home, but we have our delinquency rates like less than 10%. And these are individuals who wouldn't qualify for traditional bank financing. So when you think about that, that's amazing. In my time and in Sheila's time before me, Sheila Dodd, who was the executive director, we've had no foreclosures, no, evictions or anything to that regard with our homeowners. So our success rate's pretty astronomical when you think about it in that regard. We do have homeowners that move out. Right now we have 118 homes built, fully 100, like I said, 119 with the solar house. So 2 more being added this spring. We still have 70 mortgages that we're holding in-house of those homeowners over 30 years. Some of those have fully paid off their mortgage and just still live in the house that they bought from us. A very small percentage are actually relocating, even though they have the ability to do so, which I think is good news for the community as a whole. that they're taking roots in that neighborhood. We know homeowners that I didn't throw are more active in their communities. So, and we know our homeowners are too. It's something we encourage strongly. If it's going to school board meetings or being at a community garden or whatever it might be, that's part of the community. So we're actually very happy that our homeowners are maintaining their homes and staying kind of where the house was built. But
That's great.
Yeah.
You did mention something. I wonder if that's an issue too in general, is that to get a loan, how much percentage you have to have down is one area where banks and such can probably do a little manipulation of, requiring certain amounts without and not giving a loan if you don't have X amount down and that kind of stuff.
Sure. And I think one of the things that I think, even from a racial perspective or a family perspective, historically, there wasn't home ownership within Black households. So then when a child or a sibling or whoever, like how many of us, and I'm one of those, my parents helped me a little bit when we got into our first house because they had home equity that they could use to help us get that first down payment. When that doesn't exist, that's where I think government programs needs to step up and provide some help with that down payment assistance. And there are some programs out there for that. I just want to make sure they continue to be there and be available. And that banks, I think that's where it maybe happens more. And I don't think it's intentionally discriminatory, but it ends up being this way. Banks have trouble going through the government programs because they are challenging to do all the paperwork. It is a lot of work and it is hard. So there's money out there, but they're not necessarily motivated to go after that money just because of the time commitment. So those are things that I think continue to need to be some focus and some support on. And so we do counsel all of our homeowners, but we also do over 120 potential homeowners every year, just in terms of regular counseling, in terms of improving credit score, how to communicate with a bank, if there is discrimination, whatever it might be. A number of those homeowners go on to get bank financing, and we help them through that process. So those are the things we can help with and help make a difference. Not only Habitat, but I think help change this narrative.
I didn't
All
realize
right.
how much advocacy work you guys are doing. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good.
So it is about 11:55, and Chad, thank you so much. Very informative presentation, and I think it makes us all more aware of what is actually going on, not only across the nation, but right here in Champaign-Urbana.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah,
Our pleasure. Thank you.
yeah. Bye-bye.